They brought darkness but chaos fought back. HFY Epic Sci-Fi Stories. Hashtag CO title asterisk. Asterisk they brought darkness but chaos fought back. HFY Epic Sci-Fi Stories asterisk. What happens when an ancient force of darkness, capable of devouring entire galaxies, sets its sights on Earth? When the unstoppable Shadowborn descend, chaos erupts but not the kind they expected. Humanity, scarred and desperate, joins forces with an alien race to fight back. Sacrifices will be made, alliances will be forged, and the very definition of survival will be rewritten. But in the face of such overwhelming destruction, can chaos truly triumph over the void? Stay with us as we unravel a story of resilience, sacrifice, and the unyielding power of hope. The silence came like a thief in the night, stealing what had always been constant. For decades, the vast machinery of Earth's deep space monitoring systems had been attuned to the eternal hum of the universe. It was a symphony of the cosmos, radio waves echoing from ancient, dying stars, the rhythmic pulse of distant pulsars, and the faint, ghostly whispers of galaxies too far to comprehend. It was the sound of existence itself. But then, without warning, it stopped. At orbital listening station Epsilon, perched high above the Earth's atmosphere, the usual quiet bustle of the control room was replaced by a suffocating stillness. Callum, a young intern fresh out of university, sat at his console, staring at the screen with wide, disbelieving eyes. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, frozen in place as he tried to process the impossible. "It's gone," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the station's power systems. The room grew colder, or at least it felt that way. The absence of the cosmic hum wasn't just silence, it was an emptiness, a void that seemed to press against the edges of their minds. And then, breaking through the stillness, came the sound. It wasn't a sound meant for human ears. Deep, guttural, and resonant, it carried a weight that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of those who heard it. Callum clutched his chest instinctively, as if the sound were reaching inside him, pulling at something primal and ancient. The others in the room began to gather around his station, their faces pale and tense. Someone whispered, "What is that?" but no one had an answer. The station's translation software struggled, its algorithms grinding through the alien noise for hours. The team watched in tense silence as fragments of meaning began to emerge, piecing themselves together on the screen. When the final message appeared, the room fell into a stunned, horrified quiet. "We are coming. Prepare to kneel or burn." The warning had barely settled into their minds when the skies over Earth began to darken. At first, it seemed like a storm, a massive, unnatural shadow spreading across the heavens. But there was no thunder, no lightning. Instead, the darkness fractured into shapes, their edges sharp and unnatural, as if the night sky itself were being torn apart. And then they emerged. Massive ships, blacker than the void they came from, slid into view like predators stalking their prey. Their surfaces were smooth and unbroken, absorbing the light around them, making them appear like holes in the fabric of reality. They hung in orbit, silent and unmoving, yet their presence was suffocating, pressing down on the world below like an unspoken threat. The largest of them, a behemoth they would later call the Oblivion Spear, was so vast that it cast a shadow over entire cities. Its silhouette stretched across the land, a harbinger of doom that seemed to drain the color from the world beneath it. On the ground, chaos erupted. People poured into the streets, their faces turned upward in terror and disbelief. News channels broadcast the images of the alien fleet, their anchors struggling to find words that could capture the magnitude of what was happening. Prayers and panic filled the air as humanity stared into the abyss of its own extinction. Far beneath the surface, in the fortified underground chambers of the United Earth Council's command center, President Eleanor Royce stood before a room of generals, scientists, and world leaders. The air was thick with tension, the weight of their collective fear pressing down on everyone present. Elena's face was pale, but her eyes burned with a fierce determination. She was no stranger to crises. Her presidency had been forged in the fires of war and disaster, but this was unlike anything she had ever faced. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tense murmurs in the room. "We've faced extinction before," she began, her tone steady despite the chaos raging above. Her words carried the weight of someone who understood the stakes, someone who had already accepted the possibility of death but refused to surrender to it. "This isn't just about us," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room. "If we fall, they will take everything. Every world, every species they encounter. This is not a war for survival, it's a war for existence itself." She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. "We fight, or we die." For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the faint hum of the command center's systems. Then, slowly, one by one, the people in the room nodded. Generals began barking orders, scientists scrambled to their stations, and the room erupted into a controlled frenzy of activity. Above them, the alien fleet remained still, their shadows stretching across the earth like a promise of what was to come. But beneath the surface, humanity prepared to fight back. The attack began without warning, a sudden and merciless strike that shattered any hope Earth had of diplomacy. The Varnok did not come to negotiate. They came to destroy. High above the Earth, the alien ships hung motionless for what felt like an eternity, their black forms blotting out the stars. Then, as if the universe itself had taken a sharp breath, the first beam of light descended. It was not light as humanity knew it. This was something unnatural, an energy so bright it burned the eyes, yet so cold it seemed to freeze the soul. The beam lanced downward, cutting through the atmosphere with a soundless fury, and when it struck, the world beneath it ceased to exist. Tokyo was the first to fall. The city, alive with the hum of millions of lives, was reduced to a molten crater in seconds. Skyscrapers melted like wax, their steel frames twisting and collapsing into the inferno. The streets, once teeming with people, became rivers of fire. A silence followed the destruction, not from the absence of sound, but from the sheer incomprehensibility of what had just occurred. Then came Rio de Janeiro, its vibrant colors and music swallowed by the same merciless energy. The Christ the Redeemer statue, a symbol of resilience and faith, crumbled into ash as the beam consumed the city. Johannesburg followed soon after, its golden plains lit with an unnatural glow as the Varnok brought their wrath to bear. Within hours, the death toll had climbed into the millions. The world watched in horror as one city after another vanished, their lights snuffed out like candles in a storm. Earth's military forces scrambled to respond, their efforts a frantic patchwork of desperation and defiance. Fighter jets roared into the skies, their engines screaming as they ascended toward the alien invaders. Missiles streaked upward, leaving trails of fire in their wake, and orbital railguns fired with deafening booms, sending projectiles hurtling toward the Varnok ships. But it was no use. The Varnok shields shimmered faintly as the attack struck, absorbing the onslaught with an almost mocking ease. Explosions that should have torn through steel and titanium fizzled out like raindrops on a blazing furnace. Humanity's most advanced weapons, the culmination of centuries of war and innovation, were nothing more than sparks against an inferno. On the ground, soldiers and civilians alike stared at the sky, their faces pale with disbelief. Every missile that failed, every jet that fell in flames, was a reminder of their helplessness. The Varnok were untouchable, their technology so far beyond human comprehension that it seemed like magic. Above the burning ruins of London, the battle raged on. The city was cloaked in a haze of smoke and ash, its once proud skyline now a jagged silhouette of destruction. In the skies above, Captain Adrian Cole led his squadron in a desperate assault. Adrian was a veteran, a man who had faced death countless times and lived to tell the tale. But this was different. His hands gripped the controls of his fighter jet so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Sweat dripped down his face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't dare blink. "Stay in formation," he barked into his comms, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. His squadron, a mix of seasoned pilots and fresh recruits, followed his lead, their jets weaving through the smoke as they closed in on one of the Varnoke dreadnoughts. The alien ship was massive, a floating fortress that seemed to devour the sky. Its surface was smooth and black, broken only by faint, glowing lines that pulsed like veins. As Adrian's squadron approached, they fired their missiles in unison, the projectiles streaking toward the dreadnought with deadly precision. The explosions lit up the sky, a brief, brilliant flare of hope. But when the light faded, the ship remained untouched. The missiles had struck its hull, but the energy dissipated harmlessly, leaving not so much as a scratch. "They are playing with us," Adrian muttered, his voice low and bitter. He could feel the weight of the alien ship's presence, its vastness pressing down on him like a physical force. "We're ants to them." Around him, his squadron continued their assault, their jets darting and diving as they tried to find a weakness. But it was futile. One by one, the alien ship began to retaliate, its weapons firing with cold precision. Beams of light sliced through the air, tearing through the human fighters as if they were paper. Adrian watched as one of his recruits, a young pilot named Sarah, was caught in a blast. Her jet exploded in a fiery burst, the debris scattering like ashes in the wind. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. "Pull back," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Fall back now." But it was too late. The Varnoke dreadnought continued its assault, its weapons cutting through the squadron with ruthless efficiency. Adrian's jet was hit, the controls sparking and shuddering as he fought to keep it steady. As his jet spiraled toward the ground, he caught one last glimpse of the alien ship, its dark form looming above the burning city. It was a predator, and humanity was its prey. Adrian closed his eyes, bracing for impact. The last thought that crossed his mind was not of fear, but of anger, a burning, unrelenting fury at the creatures who had brought this destruction. And then, the ground rose up to meet him. The Nevada desert stretched out under a cold, silver moon, its vast emptiness broken only by the distant glow of the crash site. Smoke rose in dark, curling tendrils from the wreckage, twisting into the night sky like silent cries of anguish. The air was heavy with the acrid stench of scorched metal and burning earth, a grim reminder of the chaos that had engulfed the world. Dr. Lyra Kale stood at the edge of the crater, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the alien vessel. The Varnoke scout ship lay shattered, its sleek, black surface cracked and smoking. It looked almost alive, its surface faintly pulsing with a dim, eerie light, as though the ship itself was mourning its fall. Around her, the recovery team moved cautiously, their boots crunching against the glass like sand fused by the heat of the impact. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional hiss of cooling metal or the distant howl of the desert wind. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of fear and curiosity driving her forward. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the wreckage. As they approached the ship, a low, guttural sound emerged from the shadows within. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't static. It was alive. The creature emerged slowly, dragging itself from the wreckage with a painful, deliberate effort. It was massive, its towering form hunched under the weight of its injuries. Its black exoskeleton shimmered faintly in the moonlight, an unnatural sheen that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. Lyra froze, her breath hitching as she took in the sight of the alien. Its many limbs twitched and quivered, some bent at unnatural angles, others trailing dark fluid that pooled beneath it. Its face, or what passed for one, was a grotesque blend of sharp angles and alien symmetry, its eyes glowing faintly with an inner light that flickered like dying embers. It hissed, a deep, resonant sound that sent shivers down her spine. The team raised their weapons instinctively, the tension crackling in the air like a live wire. But then, it spoke. "Help us." The words were garbled, distorted, as though they had been dragged through layers of static and pain. But they were unmistakable. The creature, this monstrous invader that had brought so much destruction, was pleading. For a moment, no one moved. The desert seemed to hold its breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. Lyra stepped forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "You want help?" she asked, her words slow and deliberate. The creature's glowing eyes fixed on her, its gaze heavy with something she couldn't quite name. Desperation? Fear? Pain? It nodded, the movement jerky and strained. "Shadowborn," it rasped, the word scraping out of its throat like broken glass. "They come. Devour all." It took hours of painstaking work to piece together the truth. The creature's speech was fragmented, its knowledge alien and incomprehensible, but Lyra and her team were relentless. They worked through the night, their faces lit by the cold glow of their equipment as they struggled to make sense of the horrifying revelations. The Varnoke were not conquerors by choice. They were refugees, fleeing from a terror that defied understanding. The Shadowborn. The name itself sent chills through the team. The Varnoke described them as interdimensional predators, beings that existed beyond the boundaries of known reality. They were not creatures of flesh and blood, but entities of pure hunger, devouring entire worlds, entire dimensions, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. Every planet the Varnoke had conquered, every civilization they had destroyed, was not an act of malice but of desperation. Each world was a temporary shield, a barrier to slow the inevitable advance of the Shadowborn. As Lyra listened, her hands trembled. The weight of the revelation was almost too much to bear. They weren't just fighting for Earth. They were fighting for existence itself. Later, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Lyra stood before the alien, her mind racing with questions and fears. The creature was still now, its massive form slumped against the wreckage, its breathing shallow and labored. "Why tell us this?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why not just destroy us like the others?" The Varnoke's glowing eyes flickered weakly as it turned its gaze to her. For a moment, she thought it wouldn't answer. But then, with a sound that was almost a sigh, it spoke. "No choice," it rasped. "Fight, or die. Together, or nothing." Lyra felt a chill run through her. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was vast and terrifying. This wasn't just Earth's war anymore. It was a war for everything, every star, every galaxy, every life that had ever existed or ever would. When she relayed the information to President Royce later that day, her voice trembled with the weight of it. "We're not just fighting for Earth," she said, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. "We're fighting for existence itself." And somewhere, far beyond the stars, the Shadowborn stirred. The room was silent, the air thick with tension as President Royce stood at the head of the War Council. Her face was pale but resolute, her sharp eyes scanning the grim faces of her advisors. Around her, the glow of holographic displays painted the room in shifting hues of blue and red, showing Earth's dwindling defenses and the ominous signs of something far worse at the edges of the solar system. The Shadowborn were coming. Royce's voice, steady and commanding, broke the silence. "We have no choice," she said firmly. "If we fight alone, we die alone. Send a transmission." It was a gamble, a desperate move in a game where the stakes were nothing less than survival. The encrypted message, sent through channels barely understood by Earth scientists, was aimed directly at the Varnoke flagship, the Oblivion Spear. The ship hung in orbit like a black monolith, its surface glinting faintly as it absorbed the light of the sun. The message was simple: a truce. An alliance. "Fight with us, or we all fall." The reply came hours later. The holographic display in the council chamber flickered to life, and the image of War Master Zorth filled the room. He was a towering figure, his form clad in dark, chitinous armor that seemed to shift and ripple like living shadows. His face was a mask of sharp angles and harsh lines, his glowing eyes burning with cold intensity. "You dare to contact us?" Zorth growled, his voice a low rumble like grinding metal. It reverberated through the chamber, sending chills down the spines of everyone present. "Your kind is weak. You are chaos, unworthy of survival." Royce stood her ground, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "We are weak alone," she admitted, her voice calm but unyielding. "But together, we can stand against them. Against the Shadowborn." Zorth's eyes narrowed, the light within them flickering. For a moment, he was silent, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned forward, his massive form casting a shadow that seemed to reach through the screen. "Do you think we fear them less than you?" he hissed. "The Shadowborn do not merely destroy. They consume. They unravel reality itself. We have fought them across countless worlds, and each time, we have failed. What makes you think your pathetic species can succeed where so many others have fallen?" Royce met his gaze without flinching. "Because we have no other choice," she said simply. "And neither do you?" The Shadowborn made their presence known before Zorth could respond. Out on the edges of the solar system, the void rippled and twisted as something began to emerge. The darkness there deepened, becoming a living thing, a shifting mass of shadow that devoured the light around it. It was impossible to define its shape. It was as though the universe itself was unraveling at its edges, folding in on itself to create something that should not exist. The Varnoke sensors picked up the disturbance first, their advanced systems screaming warnings as the Shadowborn began to manifest. The Oblivion Spear sent out a pulse of energy, scanning the anomaly, but the data it returned was incomprehensible, fractured and distorted, as if the very act of observing the Shadowborn warped reality. Zorth's gaze shifted, his expression darkening as the reports flooded in. For the first time, a flicker of something other than disdain crossed his face. Fear. He turned back to Royce, his voice low and grudging. "Your chaos may be your only strength," he admitted, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "You fight without reason, without order. You adapt, you endure. Perhaps that is what we need." Royce nodded, her expression grim. "Then we have an agreement." Zorth's eyes burned brighter, his tone sharp and unyielding. "We will fight together," he said. "But know this, if you betray us, if your chaos turns against us, we will end you first. There will be no mercy." The uneasy alliance was forged in that moment, a fragile thread binding two species that had been enemies mere hours before. The Varnoke fleet, vast and terrible, began to reposition itself, their ships forming a defensive line alongside Earth's battered forces. On the ground, soldiers and civilians alike watched the skies with a mix of awe and dread as the alien ships descended into Earth's atmosphere, their massive forms casting long shadows over cities and wastelands alike. The Varnoke warriors emerged from their vessels, towering figures clad in their dark, living armor. They moved with precision and purpose, their every step a reminder of their power. But there was no hostility now, only a grim determination. The humans and the Varnoke stood side by side, their differences momentarily set aside as they prepared for the battle to come. In the command center, Royce stood with Zorth, the two leaders exchanging a brief, tense glance. "We fight together," Royce said quietly, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "For now," Zorth replied, his tone cold but resolute. "Do not make me regret this." Beyond the horizon, the first tendrils of the Shadowborn crept closer, their dark forms twisting and writhing as they reached for the light. The final battle was coming, and the fragile alliance would be tested in ways neither side could yet imagine. They came not as an army, but as a force of nature, a storm that shattered reality itself. The Shadowborn descended upon the universe like a plague, their forms shifting and twisting in ways that defied comprehension. They were not creatures of flesh or even matter, they were living voids, dark and infinite, their presence bending the very fabric of existence around them. In the cold reaches of space, the Varnoke fleet stood ready, their massive ships forming an impenetrable wall of black steel and energy. But against the Shadowborn, it was like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. The first wave of the enemy struck without warning, their arrival marked by ripples in space that spread like cracks across a fragile glass pane. The Shadowborn did not attack in any conventional sense. They simply were. Their forms, ever shifting and chaotic, tore through the Varnoke ships as though they were paper. Entire fleets vanished in moments, swallowed by the darkness. Ships imploded into themselves, collapsing into black holes that blinked out of existence as quickly as they had formed. The screams of the Varnoke echoed through the void, their advanced technology useless against the incomprehensible enemy. War Master Zorth watched from the command deck of the Oblivion Spear, his glowing eyes narrowing as he witnessed his forces being unmade. His claws clenched tightly around the railing, the metal groaning under the pressure. "So, this is the true face of the Shadowborn," he muttered, his voice low and grim. On Earth, the nightmare was no less terrifying. In New York, the sky darkened as a single Shadowborn entity descended upon the city. Its form was a mass of writhing tendrils, each one stretching impossibly far, flickering in and out of existence as though it were both there and not there at the same time. The creature moved like a storm, its tendrils lashing out at the skyscrapers that dared to reach for the heavens. Glass shattered and steel groaned as entire buildings crumbled under its touch. The tendrils didn't just destroy, they consumed. Everything they touched, concrete, metal, flesh, was pulled into the darkness, vanishing as though it had never existed. On the streets below, chaos reigned. Civilians screamed as they fled, their faces pale with terror. Cars were abandoned in the middle of the roads, their drivers too panicked to care about anything but escape. Parents clutched their children, their desperate cries drowned out by the deafening roar of collapsing buildings. Soldiers stood their ground, their weapons trained on the creature. Bullets and missiles tore through the air, but they might as well have been pebbles thrown into the ocean. The Shadowborn absorbed the attacks without slowing, their forms rippling briefly before returning to their terrible, unyielding advance. A young soldier, trembling but resolute, fired a rocket directly at the creature's core. For a brief moment, the explosion lit up the sky, a flash of hope in the overwhelming darkness. But when the smoke cleared, the Shadowborn was unharmed. Its tendrils lashed out, and the soldier was gone, swallowed by the void. In Tokyo, the story was different. The city was already a ruin, its streets littered with the wreckage of buildings and the bodies of the fallen. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning metal. But amidst the devastation, A group of guerrilla fighters moved with purpose, their faces grim but determined. They had no illusions about their chances. They knew that against the Shadowborn, victory was almost impossible. But they also knew that humanity's strength had always been its ability to adapt, to find a way even in the darkest of times. The creature they faced was massive, its form a swirling vortex of darkness that seemed to suck the light from the world around it. Its tendrils writhed and lashed, tearing through the remains of the city with terrifying ease. But the fighters had a plan. Using the ruins as cover, they lured the creature into a narrow alleyway, its massive form forcing it to slow as it pursued them. They moved quickly, their steps silent as they set their trap, a network of explosives and electromagnetic disruptors, carefully placed and timed. When the Shadowborn reached the center of the trap, the leader of the group, a woman with a scar running down the side of her face, gave the signal. The explosives detonated in a deafening roar, the shockwave tearing through the air. At the same time, the disruptors activated, sending out pulses of energy that rippled through the creature's form. For a moment, the Shadowborn faltered. Its tendrils recoiled, its form flickering and distorting as though it were struggling to maintain its presence in this reality. The fighters watched in awe as the creature let out a sound, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. It wasn't a roar of anger or pain. It was something else. Surprise. The Shadowborn retreated, its tendrils withdrawing as its form began to dissolve into the darkness from which it had come. For the first time, humanity had struck back. For the first time, they had drawn blood. Word of the victory spread quickly, a spark of hope in the overwhelming despair. Across the world, humanity began to rally, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that the Shadowborn were not invincible. But the cost was high. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, and the Shadowborn's wrath was far from spent. The sky above remained dark, the air heavy with the promise of more destruction to come. In the ruins of Tokyo, the scarred leader of the guerrilla fighters looked up at the sky, her expression hard but resolute. "They can bleed," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of her determination. "And if they can bleed, we can kill them." Far above, in the void of space, the Shadowborn stirred, their forms shifting and writhing as they prepared for the next wave. The battle was far from over, and the true test of humanity's strength was yet to come. Beneath the ancient soil of Geneva, far below the surface where sunlight could never reach, a secret laboratory hummed with life. Its corridors were dimly lit, the air thick with tension and the faint scent of ozone from overworked machines. This was where hope was being forged. Dr. Kale stood at the center of the chaos, her sharp eyes scanning the streams of data on the flickering monitors. Around her, scientists moved like shadows, their voices low and hurried as they exchanged theories and calculations. The room was a maze of wires and strange, alien machinery, pieces of stolen Varnoke technology that pulsed with an eerie, otherworldly glow. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the controls of the massive device before her. It was a strange construct, unlike anything humanity had ever built, sleek and angular, its surface etched with glowing, shifting symbols that seemed to hum with a life of their own. The reality binder. "This is it," she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the hum of the machine. "The only chance we have." The Shadowborn were creatures of chaos, beings that existed in dimensions beyond human comprehension. They slipped through the cracks of reality, untethered by the laws of physics. But the reality binder was designed to change that. If it worked, it would force the creatures to remain in a single dimension, trapping them in a physical form that could be destroyed. The first test came sooner than anyone expected. In the vast emptiness of the Australian outback, a Shadowborn entity had descended. The land stretched endlessly beneath the creature, barren and dry, the red earth cracked and lifeless. The sky above was a deep, unnatural black, as though the creature's presence had drained the light from the heavens. The Shadowborn loomed over the landscape, its form a mass of shifting darkness, tendrils stretching out like the arms of some ancient, malevolent god. The air around it was heavy, suffocating, filled with an unnatural stillness that pressed against the minds of those who dared to approach. Human and Varnoak forces had gathered on the outskirts of the creature's domain, their uneasy alliance holding firm in the face of the greater threat. Soldiers stood in tense silence, their weapons at the ready, while Varnoak warriors loomed behind them, their dark armor glinting faintly in the dim light. Dr. Kale's voice crackled over the comms. "The reality binder is ready. Activated on my mark." The device had been mounted on a makeshift platform, its alien design standing out starkly against the rugged landscape. As the final preparations were made, the creature began to move. Its tendrils writhed and twisted, reaching out toward the gathered forces. The earth trembled beneath its weight, cracks spreading like spiderwebs across the ground. "Now!" Kale's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. The reality binder roared to life. A pulse of energy erupted from the device, invisible but undeniable, rippling through the air like a silent scream. The symbols etched into its surface glowed brighter, their light intensifying until it was almost blinding. The Shadowborn froze. For the first time, the creature's movements faltered. Its tendrils recoiled, twisting in on themselves as though in pain. The air around it seemed to shimmer, the edges of its form growing sharper, more defined. It was no longer a formless void, no longer an abstract nightmare. The reality binder had done its work. It had trapped the Shadowborn in a single dimension, forcing it to take on a physical form. Then came the sound. A scream tore through the air, but it was not a sound made by any living thing. It was a psychic wail, a noise that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the mind. Soldiers clutched their heads, some dropping to their knees as the sound filled their thoughts with images of chaos and despair. Even the Varnoak warriors faltered, their stoic expressions breaking as they struggled against the overwhelming force of the creature's anguish. But the forces held their ground. "Fire!" came the command, shouted by a human officer whose voice trembled but did not break. The soldiers opened fire, their weapons blazing as bullets and missiles tore through the air. The Varnoak joined in, their advanced weaponry unleashing beams of searing energy that struck the creature with unrelenting precision. The Shadowborn writhed, its form flickering and distorting as it fought against the bonds of the reality binder. Its tendrils lashed out wildly, tearing through the ground and sending shockwaves rippling through the battlefield. But it could not escape. The combined firepower of humanity and the Varnoak rained down upon it, relentless and unyielding. The creature's form began to collapse, its dark mass unraveling like smoke caught in a storm. Finally, with one last, ear-splitting wail, the Shadowborn disintegrated. Its form dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only silence and the faint smell of ozone. The battlefield was still. Soldiers and Varnoak alike stood frozen, their weapons lowered as they stared at the empty space where the creature had been. The reality binder, its work complete, powered down with a low hum, its glow fading to a dull, lifeless gray. Dr. Kale's voice came through the comms, trembling with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "We did it," she said softly. "It works." On the ground, a young soldier let out a shaky breath, his hands still gripping his weapon. "We can kill them," he whispered, his voice filled with a fragile hope. "We can actually kill them." But even as the soldiers began to cheer, their voices rising in celebration, the sky above remained dark. The Shadowborn were not defeated, not yet. This was only the beginning, a single victory in a war that would determine the fate of all existence. Far away, in the depths of space, the rest of the Shadowborn stirred, their forms shifting and writhing as they felt the death of one of their own. And in the shadows of the Geneva laboratory, Dr. Kale knew that their work was far from over. The reality binder was a weapon, yes. But it was also a beacon, a signal to the Shadowborn that humanity was no longer powerless. And that signal would not go unanswered. The vanguard was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. It loomed in the dry dock like a sleeping leviathan, its hull a seamless blend of human craftsmanship and alien ingenuity. The ship's surface shimmered faintly, an iridescent sheen from the Varnoke alloys that coated it, pulsing with an almost organic light. Jagged, angular human designs merged with the sleek, fluid curves of Varnoke architecture, creating a warship that looked as though it had been pulled from the dreams of a mad genius. Weapons bristled along its sides, cannons capable of firing energy beams that could pierce the void itself, missile bays designed to deliver payloads laced with anti-Shadowborn disruptors, and experimental devices powered by the same technology as the reality binder. The Vanguard was not just a ship, it was a message. A declaration that humanity and the Varnoke would not go quietly into the abyss. Inside, the air buzzed with tension and purpose. The crew moved quickly through the narrow corridors, their boots clanging against the metal floors. Engineers barked orders as they ran final diagnostics, their hands blackened with grease and alien residue. Soldiers checked their weapons, their faces set in grim determination. There was no laughter, no idle chatter, only the quiet hum of resolve. At the heart of the ship, in the command center, Captain Adrian Cole stood before his crew. His presence was magnetic, his voice steady and commanding as he addressed them. "This isn't just about Earth anymore," he began, his piercing eyes scanning the room. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. "This is about every world, every species they've destroyed. The Shadowborn have taken everything from us, our homes, our families, our futures. But today, we take something back." His gaze hardened, his voice rising with conviction. "They think they are chaos. They think they are unstoppable. But they've never faced us. Let's show them what chaos can do." The crew erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the ship. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was hope. As the Vanguard prepared to launch, the skies above Earth filled with ships, human and Varnoke vessels alike, their engines glowing like stars against the darkness. The fleet moved as one, a united force ready to meet the Shadowborn head-on. And at the center of it all, the Vanguard led the charge, its engines roaring as it tore through the atmosphere and into the void beyond. The council chamber aboard the Varnoke flagship was a stark, imposing room, its walls lined with dark metal that seemed to absorb all light. At the center of the room stood a massive table, its surface glowing with a holographic projection of the solar system. Jupiter loomed large in a display, its swirling storms casting an ominous shadow over the gathered leaders. President Royce stood at one end of the table, her hands gripping its edges as she leaned forward. Her face was pale but resolute, her eyes burning with the fire of someone who refused to give in to despair. Across from her, War Master Zorth towered over the table, his armored form radiating an aura of barely restrained fury. "This is it," Royce said, her voice steady despite the fear that lingered in her eyes. "We lure them here, to Jupiter. Every ship, every soldier, every weapon we have will be waiting for them. It's a trap, pure and simple. We draw them in, and we hit them with everything we've got." Zorth's claws tapped against the table as he studied the projection. "The Shadowborn are not fools," he rumbled, his deep voice reverberating through the room. "They will sense the trap." Royce nodded. "They will. But they won't care. They've never cared. They see us as insects, beneath their notice. They'll come because they think they are unstoppable. And that's when we hit them." The room fell silent as the weight of the plan settled over everyone. It was a gamble, a desperate, reckless gamble. But it was also their only chance. Zorth finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "And if we fail?" Royce straightened, her gaze unwavering as she met his eyes. "If we fail, there won't be anything left to save." The plan was set into motion. The combined fleets of Earth and the Varnoke began to gather near Jupiter, their ships forming a massive defensive line around the gas giant. The sight was awe-inspiring, thousands of vessels, their engines burning brightly against the endless black of space. The Vanguard took its place at the forefront of the fleet, its weapons primed and ready. Inside the ship, the crew worked with a quiet intensity, their movements precise and efficient. There was no room for error. Not now. As the fleets prepared, the Shadowborn began to stir. Across the galaxy, their forms writhed and shifted, sensing the gathering of their prey. They moved as one, a tide of darkness sweeping through the void, their numbers endless. The stars seemed to dim in their wake, their presence a black hole that consumed all light and hope. On the bridge of the Vanguard, Captain Cole watched the approaching enemy on the ship's display. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The Shadowborn were coming, an unstoppable wave of chaos and destruction. But this time, humanity and the Varnoke would not face them alone. "This is it," Cole said quietly, his voice carrying through the bridge. "The final stand. Let's make it count." As the Shadowborn closed in, the tension reached its breaking point. The fleet waited in silence, their weapons trained on the enemy. The air was thick with anticipation, every second stretching into an eternity. Then, the Shadowborn arrived. They came like a storm, their forms blotting out the stars as they descended upon the fleet. Tendrils of darkness lashed out, tearing through the void with terrifying speed. The ships shook as the first wave of the enemy struck, their shields flaring brightly under the assault. But this time, humanity and the Varnoke were ready. The fleet unleashed a torrent of firepower, beams of energy and missiles streaking through the darkness to strike the Shadowborn. The Vanguard led the charge, its weapons tearing through the enemy with ruthless precision. The Reality Binder, mounted at the heart of the ship, pulsed with power, trapping the Shadowborn in physical space and leaving them vulnerable to attack. The battle raged on, chaos and order colliding in a desperate struggle for survival. Ships exploded in brilliant flashes of light, their debris scattering across the battlefield. The screams of the dying echoed through the comms, a grim reminder of the cost of their fight. But amidst the carnage, there was hope. For the first time, the Shadowborn faltered. Their forms flickered and distorted as the fleet's weapons tore into them. The tide was beginning to turn. And as the Vanguard pressed forward, its engines burning bright, Captain Cole's voice rang out across the comms. "Hold the line," he commanded, his voice filled with unshakable resolve. "For Earth. For every world they've destroyed. We fight to the end." The final battle had begun. And the fate of the universe hung in the balance. Jupiter loomed like a god of storms, its swirling red and gold clouds churning with an ancient, unrelenting fury. The colossal gas giant seemed almost alive, its endless tempests roaring beneath the chaos that now unfolded in its orbit. The battle was a maelstrom of fire and shadow, light and darkness colliding in a desperate struggle for survival. Thousands of ships filled the void, their sleek forms weaving through the chaos like fireflies caught in a hurricane. Human vessels, sturdy and angular, fought side by side with the elegant, almost organic designs of the Varnoke fleet. The combined armada was a fragile thread of order stretched taut against the overwhelming tide of the Shadowborn. The creatures came in waves, their forms vast and incomprehensible, as though the void itself had come alive to devour the light. Tendrils of darkness lashed out, each one as thick as a ship's hull, writhing with a terrible, unnatural grace. Their movements defied logic, twisting through space in ways that made the mind ache to comprehend. The Vanguard was at the forefront, its hull gleaming with a faint, pulsing light of its hybrid technology. Captain Adrian Cole stood firm on the bridge, his hands gripping the controls with a calm intensity that belied the storm of emotions raging within him. His crew worked with machine-like precision, their faces pale but determined as they carried out his orders. "Focus fire on the central cluster," Cole barked, his voice cutting through the din of alarms and shouted reports. "Deploy the reality binders now." Outside, the Vanguard unleashed its fury. Beams of searing energy lanced through the darkness, each shot finding its mark with devastating precision. Missiles streaked through space, their trails burning bright before exploding in bursts of light that tore through the Shadowborn's forms. The reality binders were activated, their invisible pulses rippling through the battlefield. The effect was immediate. The Shadowborn recoiled, their movements jerky and disoriented as they were forced into physical space. For the first time, the creatures were vulnerable. But they were not defenseless. A massive tendril lashed out toward the Vanguard, moving with impossible speed. "Evasive maneuvers," Cole shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. The ship veered to the side, its engines roaring as it narrowly avoided the attack. The tendril smashed into a nearby Varnoak cruiser, splitting it in two. The explosion lit up the battlefield, a brief, brilliant flash of light before the darkness closed in again. Cole gritted his teeth, his eyes blazing with determination. "We're not done yet," he muttered under his breath. "Not by a long shot." The battle raged on, a symphony of destruction and defiance. Ships exploded in fiery bursts, their debris scattering like falling stars. The screams of the dying echoed through the comms, a haunting reminder of the cost of their resistance. But amidst the chaos, the fleet held its ground. The Vanguard pressed forward, its weapons blazing as it tore through the enemy. Cole's voice rang out across the comms, a beacon of hope in the darkness. "Hold the line. We've got them on the ropes." Dante let up. And for a moment, it seemed as though they might actually win. But hope is a fragile thing. As the battle dragged on, it became clear that the Shadowborn were endless. For every creature destroyed, another took its place, their numbers an unrelenting tide that threatened to overwhelm the fleet. The reality binders were working, but they could only do so much. The Shadowborn were adapting, their movements growing more erratic, more dangerous. War Master Zorth stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Oblivion Spear, his towering form bathed in the dim red light of the ship's interior. The Varnoak warlord was a figure of pure strength, his dark armor scarred from countless battles. His glowing eyes narrowed as he watched the battle unfold on the massive view screen before him. He knew what had to be done. "Prepare the core for detonation," he ordered, his deep voice calm and steady. His crew hesitated, their eyes wide with shock. "My lord," one of them began, his voice trembling, "if we—" "There is no time for debate," Zorth interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Do as I command." The crew obeyed, their hands moving with grim resolve as they prepared the Oblivion Spear for its final act. Zorth opened a channel to President Royce. Her face appeared on the screen, pale and strained but still defiant. "Zorth," she said, her voice tight with tension, "what are you doing?" "What must be done," Zorth replied simply. "The largest of the Shadowborn entities, the one at the center of their formation. It is the key to their strength. If we destroy it, the others will falter." Royce's eyes widened as she realized what he meant. "You can't. There has to be another way." "There is no other way," Zorth said, cutting her off. His voice softened, just slightly. "Tell your people, Royce. Tell them that chaos is stronger than fear." Before she could respond, the transmission ended. The Oblivion Spear turned toward the heart of the Shadowborn formation, its engines flaring brightly as it accelerated. The massive Shadowborn entity loomed ahead, its form a swirling mass of darkness and malice. Tendrils lashed out toward the ship, but Zorth did not falter. Inside the ship, the crew worked in silence, their faces set with grim determination. They knew what was coming, but there was no fear, only purpose. As the Oblivion Spear closed in, Zorth stood at the center of the bridge, his massive form unmoving. He watched the creature grow larger on the view screen, its tendrils writhing like the arms of some ancient, malevolent god. "For the Varnoke," he rumbled, his voice a low growl. "For the galaxy?" The Oblivion Spear struck the creature with a blinding flash of light. The ship's antimatter core detonated, unleashing an explosion so massive that it lit up the entire battlefield. The shockwave rippled outward, tearing through the Shadowborn formation and scattering their forces. On the bridge of the Vanguard, Captain Cole shielded his eyes from the brilliant light. When it faded, he looked out at the battlefield and saw the Shadowborn faltering. The largest of the creatures was gone, its form obliterated by the explosion. But so was the Oblivion Spear. A heavy silence fell over the fleet as the realization sank in. Zorth was gone. The battle was not over, but the tide had turned. The Shadowborn were retreating, their forces scattered and disoriented. And in the heart of the chaos, amidst the wreckage of ships and the swirling storms of Jupiter, a single thought echoed through the minds of every soldier, every survivor. Sacrifice. Zorth had given everything to give them this chance. And now, it was up to them to finish what he had started. With renewed determination, the fleet pressed forward, their weapons blazing as they pursued the remnants of the Shadowborn. For Zorth. For Earth. For every world that had suffered under the Shadowborn's shadow. The battle was far from over. But for the first time, victory felt within reach. When the battle ended, silence fell over the void. It was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating quiet of exhaustion. The battlefield, once teeming with fire and shadow, was now a graveyard of twisted metal and lifeless forms. The wreckage of ships, human, Varnoke, and Shadowborn alike, drifted aimlessly in the orbit of Jupiter, their shattered remains a testament to the price of survival. The Shadowborn were gone. The monstrous entities that had once darkened the skies, their tendrils consuming entire worlds, had been defeated. Their presence, so overwhelming and suffocating, had vanished as though it had never been. But the scars they left behind were etched deep on the galaxy, on Earth, and on every soul who had fought to see this day. Earth itself bore the marks of the war. Its cities were in ruins, their towering skylines reduced to jagged silhouettes against the horizon. Ash and smoke hung in the air, swirling like ghosts over streets littered with rubble. The cries of the injured and the grieving echoed through the broken remains of civilization. Yet amidst the devastation, there was something else, a fragile, flickering spark of hope. On the bridge of the Vanguard, Captain Adrian Cole stood in silence, staring out at the wreckage. His uniform was torn and blood-stained, his face lined with exhaustion. But his eyes, weary as they were, burned with a fierce pride. They had done the impossible. They had survived. "All ships, report," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. One by one, the remaining vessels checked in, their captains speaking with a mix of relief and sorrow. The fleet had suffered heavy losses, but it was still standing. Cole closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it all wash over him. He thought of Zorth, of the Oblivion Spear, of the countless lives that had been lost to bring them to this moment. It wasn't victory, not in the way he had imagined it. But it was enough. And as the Vanguard turned its battered hull back toward Earth, the captain allowed himself a small, weary smile. The aftermath of the war was a time of rebuilding, not just of cities and ships, but of trust, hope, and the fragile bonds between species. Earth was no longer the same. Its landscapes, once vibrant and full of life, were now marred by scars of battle. Great craters dotted the land where shadowborn tendrils had struck, leaving behind barren wastelands. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble, their people scattered and struggling to survive. But amidst the ruins, there was movement. Humanity had not fallen. They were rising again, brick by brick, piece by piece. And they were not alone. The Varnoke, once distant and mistrusted, now walked side by side with humans. Their towering forms moved through the streets of Earth's shattered cities, their claws and strength helping to clear debris, their technology aiding in the rebuilding efforts. Where there had once been fear and suspicion, there was now a quiet, growing respect. President Royce stood in the heart of what remained of New York City, her figure framed by the jagged ruins of the United Nations building. The crowd before her was vast, a sea of faces, human and Varnoke alike. The air was heavy with emotion, a mixture of grief for the past and hope for the future. Her voice, steady and strong, carried across the crowd and beyond, transmitted to every corner of the galaxy. "We have faced the darkness," she began, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. "We have seen the void, the endless hunger that sought to consume us all. And yet, here we stand scarred, yes. Broken, perhaps. But alive." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "The Shadowborn thought they could extinguish us. They thought they could drown us in fear, in chaos. But they underestimated us. They underestimated what chaos truly means. Because chaos is not destruction. Chaos is change. Chaos is resilience. And chaos always wins." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising like a wave that seemed to shake the very earth beneath their feet. Royce's words echoed across the stars, carried by the hybrid colony ships that had already begun their journey into the unknown. The alliance between humanity and the Varnoke became a beacon of hope for the galaxy. Together, they shared their knowledge, their resources, and their dreams. Hybrid ships, crafted from the combined ingenuity of both species, set out into the stars, their sleek forms cutting through the void like arrows of light. These ships were not just vessels, they were symbols. Symbols of unity, of survival, of the indomitable spirit that had carried them through the darkest of times. Their crews, composed of both humans and Varnoke, worked side by side, their differences no longer a barrier but a strength. They searched for survivors, for other worlds that had been touched by the Shadowborn's darkness. They carried with them the stories of the war, the sacrifices that had been made, and the promise that no matter how far the shadows stretched, there would always be those willing to stand against them. And though the scars of the war would never fully fade, they became reminders of what had been lost, and of what had been saved. Far above the Earth, in the quiet of space, the Vanguard floated in orbit, its hull still bearing the marks of battle. Captain Cole stood alone on the observation deck, staring out at the blue and green planet below. His reflection in the glass was a ghost of the man he had once been, older, wearier, but somehow stronger. He thought of Zorth, of the countless lives that had been lost to bring them to this moment. He thought of the Shadowborn, and the darkness they had brought. And he thought of the future of the colony ships that now carried the hope of two species into the unknown. "We've earned this," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the stillness. "We've earned the right to hope." And as the first of the colony ships disappeared into the endless expanse of stars, a new era began. An era of unity. An era of exploration. An era of light. The Shadowborn are gone, but at what cost? Earth lies in ruins, heroes have fallen, and the galaxy bears the scars of a war unlike any other. Yet, amidst the ashes, a new era dawns, an era of unity, exploration, and the promise of light. What would you sacrifice to save everything you love? Could chaos truly be stronger than fear? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible tales of survival, sacrifice, and the indomitable human spirit. The stars are waiting. Are you ready to explore them with us?